Welcome back. Well, the United States and other Five Eyes alliance nations are warning that China is working to aggressively recruit current and former Western military pilots and other service members. They're doing this to help train their Air Force and Navy aviators, describing the effort as a persistent threat. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance includes the U.S., the U.K., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Joining us right now is Gatestone Institute senior fellow and author of The Coming Collapse of China and China is Going to War, Gordon Chang. Gordon, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here. Interesting developments here that the Chinese want to train and hire former military and pilots from the U.S.
Yeah, on the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landing.
Wow, in your face.
It is distressing that we have Americans who are willing to train Chinese aviators and pilots to kill other Americans. You know, a problem here is that we've educated a whole generation of Americans to abhor our country. And on top of that, we got a president who won't even call the Chinese what they call us, which is an enemy. The most that Biden is willing to come up with is a competitor. So, of course, you know, you have this generation of American in the military who don't understand who the enemy is.
Yeah, that's really important. And you make the right point, and that is that why won't he acknowledge who the Chinese Communist Party is? I mean, look how they've been undermining us. And you've got people trying to get into our, military installations to steal information, surveil information. That's why they had that surveillance balloon. And now they want to hire our pilots.
It's crazy, Maria. And Gordon, you make a great point. When you raise people and children to hate this country, they will turn on it. But I have to ask you, because the way we seem to be slapping back against this is through sanctions. Those don't seem to be working. What's your read on where that's headed? What's the deterrence?
Yeah, on the sanctions, we have sanctions which are not really intended to be serious. They're just sort of partial sanctions. And the worst thing is they're not being enforced. So, of course, they're not working. And then people say, oh, well, sanctions don't work. Well, of course they don't work when we don't intend them to work.
Yeah, and not only that, but you also have, the NDAA, for example, came out recently, the National Defense Authorization Act, and it banned several Chinese companies from doing business in the U.S. But what it didn't do is rip out the existing wiring that's already here from companies like Huawei, Hytera, and all these other Chinese companies. They're spying on us.
Yeah, and
they've got their equipment already. So what? You banned new business. The business is already happening.
Yeah. Well, you know, with regard to Huawei, they do have a rip and replace program, but it is years behind schedule. So we do have Huawei in our backbone.
Exactly.
And this just shows a lack of seriousness on the part of the administration to protect us.
Meanwhile, President Biden, I don't know if he's just confused or he's compromised or just doesn't care. I mean, he mixed up Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin this week in his interview with Time magazine. It was published earlier this week. He was asked whether his new Chinese tariffs would raise prices on American consumers when he made the mistake, saying he, quote, made it clear to Putin from the very beginning that we're not engaging. A Time editor's note said, quote, Biden appeared to mean Xi here, not Putin. Former President Trump has been warning about Biden's blunders on the world stage now for a year. He did so again last night on Hannity. Watch.
We have a chance of going into World War III because of our leader. So I don't want to get into what state he's in. You know, it's in one way, it's not something for me to talk about. I can tell you this: President Xi of China, Putin, Kim Jong-un, all of these leaders are at the top of their game. Mentally, they're at the top of their game, and they're dealing with somebody that's not at the top of his game.
I mean, obviously, our allies as well as adversaries are watching Biden on the world stage, Gordon.
Yeah. You know, you look at that Time interview transcript, it is really distressing. You know, anybody can make a mistake, you know, switching one name for another. But the point is, you go through that transcript, you see all sorts of non sequiturs. Yes, Biden is speaking English, but he's not making sense. And what's even worse is that there are a number of places in that transcript where the transcript provider put in words unintelligible, which means he's not speaking English.
Yeah.
And so you can clearly see the mental deterioration.
That's why the White House will not release the Robert Hur audio tapes, because apparently they were doctored. They were edited. The transcript was edited. Like, they took out the ums and the ahs and the whatever. So that's why the House Republicans want to see the actual, they want to hear the transcript. But, Mark, I want you to weigh in on this, because Biden also told Time magazine that China's economy is on the brink.
Yeah.
This is going to have implications for the U.S.
Well, China's economy is on the brink. For one, we talked about this, I think it was last week, Gordon. We talked about the ghost towns that they've built, and that's certainly an issue for them. But let's talk briefly about the fertility rate there, right? Because in order for an economy to grow, you need population growth, you need productivity growth, and I believe the fertility rate for replacement, to make sure you have as many people being born as dying, is 2.1. China's trending towards 1.0. They actually saw their population shrink last year. What do you make of that and the long-term negative economic implications there?
When you look at long-term, at the turn of this century, China, which is now 1.4 billion people, will probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 480 to 500 million people. A Chinese demographer actually a couple months ago said China's going to have 310 million people at the end of the century. Now, I don't think it's going to be that low, but the point is China will probably lose 2/3 of its population in the next 80 years. And that really means that we've never seen this in a country before in the absence of war or disease. And that means China is at a point where it's going to fail just because it won't have people.
And they're trying to hide this, that the economy is doing as poorly as it is. Certainly this property decline is a lot more significant than they're making it out to be.
And it's accelerating, too.
Yeah.
You know, we're seeing all sorts of numbers about sales, about new starts, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
You know, property used to be somewhere about 24-25% of Chinese GDP. Now it's down to 19, and it's probably going to sink even more. And this means that the core of the Chinese economy is failing. And so they have no answer to this at all.
So can they still beat America, even though their economy is failing? I mean, through theft?
Well, they can do it through theft, but also remember that Xi Jinping now has an incentive to go to war because he has to see a closing window of opportunity. And one of the reasons, what you mentioned, because of demography.
Yeah.
You can intimidate everybody else if you're 1.4 billion people. You can't intimidate if you're 310 million people.
That's what I had to come back to, Gordon, is that it seems like for China, the military might and economic prowess are really two sides of the same coin. Are they more incentivized to go take over Taiwan now militarily?
Well, they certainly are, because if you think that right now they have this window, I mean, and they have the window for a number of reasons, and one of them is that we're not really as prepared as we need to be, but we are getting better. Xi Jinping can see that, and because he is mentally sharp, as Trump said, you know, he can see where the trend lines are, and they're not good for China.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's first deputy foreign minister visiting China yesterday, urging Beijing send a delegation to the peace summit in Switzerland later this month. China has signaled that it will likely skip the summit because Russia had not been invited, Gordon. So Russia's not invited. China may not go. They're mad that Biden's not going himself.
Well, Russia's not going, but Russia was invited. Russia turned it down. And then China's saying, oh, well, Russia's not going to be there, so we're not going to be there either. China knows all of this. This is really cynical stuff. It's playing very well in propaganda because China does very well on propaganda. But they know that Russia was invited in the first place.
Wow, that's just incredible. I mean, I think Trish's question is the one that people are trying to understand, and that's revolving around Taiwan. If China wants to go into Taiwan, wouldn't it be likely that they would do so on Joe Biden's watch?
A lot of people are worried about that, and so am I. But, you know, you got to look at what's happening in the South China Sea, in the Philippines, which is even a hotter flashpoint right now, because China's engaging in actually acts of war against the Philippines, injuring Filipino sailors, ramming their ships, using water cannons on them. And they're doing this in the defiance of explicit warnings from the State Department and from Joe Biden himself not to do it. So the Chinese basically don't believe us, or they think that we're not going to do what we say, or that we're completely incapable. Xi Jinping is at the top of his game, and Joe Biden isn't.
Maybe it's because there's no accountability or consequences for any of the behavior from Communist China. I mean, a surveillance balloon flew across the country for a week, nearly a week, before coming down. Fentanyl has been flowing in this country regularly, underlying components coming from China. A COVID cover-up. I mean,
and Biden does
no
nothing about it. I mean, that's really the point. I mean, the Chinese can see this, that Biden will issue warnings, but he doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Those are hollow warnings.
Great to have you, Gordon. Thank you so much.
Maria.
Gordon Chang joining